Hello.
Good morning.
Thank you.
Good morning, John.
Good morning, Rick. We the only ones so far?
Looks like it. No, looks like there's several on here.
Oh, okay.
Okay, looks like we're up and recording there. Brandy,
Yes.
we're good. Okay,
Rick,
and
can you hear us?
Rick and John, you can hear us okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, it's 9 o'clock. I'll call our workshop to order here. We'll do some introductions real quick. I'm Joe Taylor, Port Morrow Commissioner. Joel Peterson, Port Morrow Commissioner.
Eileen Hendricks, Port Staff. Kelly Doherty, Port Morrow Commissioner.
Mark Patton, Morrow.
Randy Warburton, Port Morrow. Lisa Middlestar, Port Morrow.
Smith Devon, Morrow.
Okay. Yes.
Kelly Morgan, Lamb Weston.
Shannon Moore and Amazon. Perfect. And then online, we'll start with Rick Stocco,
Rick Stokoe, Morrow.
Michael Campbell,
I am Michael Campbell with Stoll Reeves.
John Murray,
John Murray with Port of Morrow.
Gus Winks,
Gus Wickus, Beverage and Diamond.
Erica Lassiter,
Erica Lassiter, Port Morrow.
Marcine Brigham.
Marcine Brigham, Port Morrow Warehousing.
Perfect. That is it.
Okay. On our agenda, we have discussion here about our ordinance. This wastewater ordinance that we are working on. Did the commissioners have any direct questions that we wanted to get to Michael right away? And
I had one in here,
Okay.
but he's answered it on my,
he's already answered, okay.
I mean, I can share it with it.
And what was it? Yeah.
I asked for a copy of any of the old connection permits or discharge permits, either one that we had in place already,
Mhm.
or what the new ones were gonna look like. But
Right, so the current ordinance, commissioners provides only for connection permits. My understanding is that the port has not really implemented that provision, hasn't required permits in the past, or at least not for quite a while. So going forward, for connection permits, existing connections would essentially be grandfathered in. Any change in those connections would require a connection permit from the port. The dischargers would also be required, if the ordinance is adopted, to apply for discharge permits. So that covers the actual discharge to the port, and would be given until, currently the date is February 1st. And then the port would respond to those applications, issue permits. In the meantime, the existing discharges could continue until the port acted on those applications.
so what does a permit contain? I mean, what does it look like? What's it? I mean, is it different for everyone? Is it the same for everyone?
It's different for everybody. Depending on whether the industry has different negotiations or their outputs or anything inside there could change how that looks. Absolutely. That being stated, it's going to be fairly similar, and there'd be differences between, say, Lamb Weston and EGE, just because their outputs are wildly different, and the constituents that we're looking at are going to be different.
Mhm.
I guess, does the application piece of paper look the same? Or
Application will look the same, stuff within there for the most part will be the same. It'll just be the stuff that they are required to give us, or the things that we're looking at will be where it gets different on that. There could be other considerations too, there's stuff in here that talks about, for example, pH.
Yeah.
And let's say one industry, we could agree on having less than this what's in here and have like I say a 4.5 or 4.9 pH, which is less than the 5 minimum requirement. And we could justify that their volume is small enough to be diluted in the overall volume and not be hazardous to our digester. That could be put inside as a variance within their permit agreement, which would not necessarily be the same for everybody if they were a higher volume or considered dangerous to our digester. Little things like that.
Gotcha.
Okay. I guess one of my questions at the last meeting had to do with the very last clause in the agreement, and I know we discussed it a little bit, but maybe we could go over it again. You know, the discharge, the connection, the discharge permits. I understand if they're already connected that those would of course carry forward, but are we talking about those permits, connection? Because we don't have discharge permits yet. So connection permits, this last one where it says to the extent that any provision of this ordinance conflicts with the provision of a currently effective written agreement between the port and an industrial user that was entered into and effective before January 1, 2024, the conflicting provision does not apply to that industrial user. I guess I'm concerned that the language there, I don't want it to remove the ability of the port to enforce the needed discharge permit conditions, for example.
So
If I could respond to that, Commissioner, the concern there is that if the port has an existing contractual agreement, if the port were to require something now as part of the ordinance that would essentially violate that agreement, the port would be contractually liable. And so this is intended to protect the port if there is something that is inconsistent. You know, I guess in a public meeting, I don't want to get into specifics about particular agreements that the port has because that might become an issue later, but that is the concept there. We get into a little bit of a murky area of the law. The port probably as a public entity can essentially violate contracts, but it would be liable for damages. You know, I don't think there would be specific performance against the port. For example, if you know, the port were to decide, well, we're just going to violate this provision because we need to do that, the entity probably couldn't enforce that specific requirement, but the port could be liable for damages. And so that's what that provision is intended to do, is to protect the port from having to essentially violate a provision of an existing agreement that could expose it to pretty significant monetary damages.
Okay. Will the pre-existing agreements, though, I just am hoping that they don't impact the quality of water coming in. I mean, if we can't enforce the needed conditions of water coming into the port secondary water treatment system because of this clause and a contract that's out there, I would hope that we don't have that issue, honestly, with our users and things. But that was just my concern on this paragraph. So
no, I think that's a legitimate concern, and it's something that I think internally we struggled with. And I don't think there are a lot of those agreements out there. And certainly any new industry coming in or any increase even from an existing facility beyond what was contemplated, you know, wouldn't be subject to an agreement. And this is limited to agreements that essentially already exist. It wouldn't apply to new agreements going forward.
okay.
So those agreements would need to be consistent with the ordinance.
Sure. And how many agreements were there prior to this? It seemed like there weren't very many. Lisa, did you say just a couple or something?
Well, I said there's one, but Eileen says there's two.
Okay. Okay.
Talking about that right now. Oh,
but one may
The-
be expired.
one may be expired. We
Okay.
know we have one existing agreement.
For two reasons, I think this is probably not as big a worry as I might be sounding like, because one, we're all in this together. And if the industrial users and us, we get into a fight about water, or we somehow slow down the secondary water treatment, we're all in for trouble. So I'm thinking that we're going to work together on this regardless. And I'm glad there's only one or so agreements out there. So thank you.
And then another, Michael, I guess, because there's not all these other agreements with the industry users out there, does the fact that we've taken their water create, just an agreement because we've done it? Is, I don't know what the legal term for that is, but just like if you
Like
don't
if you
sign a
use-
lease, but you moved in, it's still in effect.
Mm-hmm.
Like land, if you use it for so long,
It's
like
yours.
yeah,
Well,
Sort of-
a contract doesn't necessarily need to be written, but that's a possibility, I guess is what I would say.
But we do have an existing ordinance and we are trying to update our existing ordinance.
so what's holding us back from updating the one that we already have?
That's what we're doing.
Yeah.
No, the one agreement that we already have. Why would we not just update that at the same time?
Well, because two parties would have to agree to that. We have a contract.
Right. Why wouldn't they agree?
It might not be beneficial to them.
Exactly.
Okay. But it would be
But
beneficial to us.
I don't know.
As long as we're protected, that's all I'm concerned about. So I don't want an agreement out there that puts us at risk for our secondary water treatment, I guess, is, as I've said.
Well, you would think it'd be beneficial to us, because you could. I don't know if you call it more controls, but. But you're right, if you can't work between both of them, then it's gonna be trouble down the road, just like John said, so.
Is there a timeline on that prior existing agreement by any chance? An expiration date?
50 years. From 93, 1990.
Okay.
I still got a few more years.
All right.
Does it comply with all of our permit agreements? I mean, do we have the ability to put those compliance onto that or no?
There's nothing in that agreement that has anything to do with wastewater constituents. It's more water guarantee is how that agreement's laid out, so. There's nothing in it that says they can put more TKN or a different pH. It doesn't even spell that out.
But they pay some pretty hefty additional fees.
So their agreement currently does not avoid them of all the variables that we have stuck inside of this. That's not what that agreement's about. It's just water guarantees.
Fresh water coming in, you mean, Matt?
Yes, primarily, yes.
Okay,
Okay.
gotcha.
And you've not had any issues with this user in the past with water quality or sending things through the system? Okay.
They're
Okay.
easy.
All right. Okay. I'm going to trust you. A couple of things. Maybe earlier, these are just notes that I made probably 3 weeks ago, so I apologize if I stumble through them. Retention of records, unless otherwise authorized in writing by the port, an industrial user must retain paper and electronic records, copies of all records related to compliance. We wouldn't authorize them not to keep records, right? It says unless authorized in writing by the port.
I think, Commissioner, that was really intended if there was something truly onerous. Again, we're trying to anticipate things. We're not anticipate the future issues that come up. Since this requirement to retain records is really for the port's benefit so that it can comply with primarily the DEQ permit, if, retaining records would be especially onerous for an entity for some reason that I'm having a hard time imagining what that might be, but it would enable the port essentially not to require someone to keep records at great expense just for the sake of keeping the records. But I have a hard time envisioning right now what circumstance that would be, but it's intended to give the port a little more flexibility and the industry not to require, a pointless effort.
Yeah. And this is the time, at the beginning of this process that we unfortunately look at those train wrecks that we might have. So having the language in the agreements, whether it's ever used or not, hopefully not, we probably should make sure that we're comfortable with them, I guess. So something was stricken on 5E. An industrial user must timely comply with any other federal, state, or local requirement to report any spill, leak, or other authorized release of substances from the industrial user's facility. Is that covered someplace else in our agreement? Would they?
So we don't have an E on this copy here.
I think he said D. Did you say
No,
D?
no, I said E. I'm working from the copy that we had for our prior
It's D.
port commission meeting.
No, it's E as an elephant, I think.
Commission, that was struck because it was redundant.
Okay.
He said he's
Okay.
working off the June one.
Yeah, sorry, I'm working off an older one. So all the red line is still in here for me, the ones that I'm looking at. So
Yes, so the one I
When
sent
we had the last
yesterday
meeting.
doesn't have it, it's removed.
Right. No, it isn't there either. Okay, just redundant then.
does it have any of the red line, or are all the red lines removed?
It
On
has
your
the
guys'
red
copy.
since June. So it's updated from the last copy you have, it has red lines from that, so June to now.
Okay, okay, sorry, I should be working off my other copy. Sorry.
Did you have another question there, John?
Well, I'm glancing through my notes. I'm sorry, I don't mean to hold everybody up. Please
You're fine.
proceed.
That's what this meeting is for, John.
Okay, thank you.
Are we just shooting from the hip then?
I guess,
Well-
I'm sorry, I'm still looking, sorry.
Yeah, I was just waiting, John. I had a question, so.
Yeah, please go ahead. I'm not finding another one right off the top of my head here, so.
Just real quick on 3H. I had to read that a couple times. To get it, how things are written, lawyers. So when it says, unless industrial discharge, the port may revoke a connection permit or discharge for good cause unless they're discharging something right away. I read that going the other direction a couple of times. So if a industry is just dumping something out there, we can say, hey, you're done right now. We're not waiting the 60 days to give them notice. Is that basically what that is saying?
That is the section that we had a difficult time with in our commission meeting. And we decided that after you read it 3 times, it reads correctly, but
Yeah,
it might make more
Yeah.
sense to us if the sentence was flipped the other way.
okay. Yes, I remember that discussion and then I read it again and
Right.
okay,
The port shall provide 60 days notice
If it
unless,
just started
Yeah.
there and put the first of the sentence at the back end,
that's right.
right.
we'd all be
Okay.
happier with that.
That's right.
Yeah, I apologize for the lawyers. If they're
But that gives the port to take action right away. When something is very egregious, I guess.
right, so the provision is that the port can revoke a permit for good cause, period, full stop. And I think the way it was in the version you had before, there was some red lines there that made it look like that sentence continued, but so the port can revoke a permit for good cause, period. That next sentence is really whether the port has to give 60 days notice before it does that. If it's an emergency, then the port can just go ahead and revoke. It doesn't need to provide prior notice. If it's not an emergency, you can still revoke for good cause no matter what. It's just that you would have to provide 60 days notice if it's not an emergency.
So, Michael, I think we would all be happier here if the sentence started with the port shall provide 60 days notice, written notice.
Mhm.
And then flip the unless the industrial discharge poses a serious or immediate danger,
I
right?
agree, that's clearer. Yeah.
This is 2 meetings now that we're struggling on that sentence structure. If we just fix it, we'll be done with it.
Will do.
Okay.
And then I had on 5A, this is more myth, I would assume, the red line where it got changed from, discharge max of 10% or less, and we crossed out 0.1 milligrams per liter. Are those equivalent? Is one much greater than the other? And probably every situation is.
Every situation is different, so. I mean, it's fine. That's what you're looking for off of that, it's agreeable.
Okay.
I might take the rap for that. What we're trying to do there is create a de minimis safe harbor for the industry. They do something that's trivial. We don't want to have to require them to notify the port every time they make some trivial or change that has a trivial effect. So we're really just trying to get at what would be trivial and of no consequence. And some of the industry folks pointed out that, well, 0.1 milligrams per liter, if it's PCBs, that might be way too much. If it's, something innocuous, it's way too low. So we went at this 10% just as a kind of a rough way to identify what would be insignificant. So that was really at the request of one of the industry comments that a percentage basis for that would probably be better than a hard number. So that was really all the thinking that went into that.
Okay.
On 3A, I wrote a question. It has to do with connections to the reuse facilities in existence on the effective date of this ordinance, and that are authorized by a connection permit issued by the port under Ordinance 90-3 may continue in accordance with the terms of that permit. Do we, as a port, have concerns with any of the connections that are in place? Are we going to ask for cleaner water? Nothing coming through that is coming through now, or what's the thought there?
I can take that. That provision, Commissioner, is really a grandfather positioning. Again, we haven't identified any connection permits at all. And so this is addressed to the connection permits. So this is the physical connection to the port. So what this is saying is that if you're already connected to the port, you can continue that connection. You don't need to now come get a connection permit from us. If you do anything though to change that, or if it for some reason was a secret connection that the port didn't know anything about, that wouldn't be grandfathered. But I guess I turn to myth. I don't think there are any issues with existing connections to the port.
No, none that we're aware of.
Okay.
But we're not going to issue permits. We're just gonna grandfather.
They're already connected, so I mean,
Are we going to install, I saw somewhere in here that we might install at that connection?
Yes.
flow meters or metering types.
Yep.
Of things. So will that, so if we don't have a connection permit, how are we going to enforce connecting or having those meters
Be part of the discharge.
part of the discharge permit?
Correct.
Okay.
Which they will be required to get.
Correct.
So
Right.
why they'd be required to get a updated connection permit? I mean,
Yeah, I wouldn't
why
mind
would we
seeing
work
that.
towards getting them an updated?
Connection permit is
Yeah.
more of a, I want to connect to your system, and the discharge is all the details that come afterwards, because I'm just making a pipe's a pipe until you do something with it.
Yeah.
And that's all a connection permit could be. It could even be arguably potable water intake to versus sanitary sewer outlet. That's all your connections to this, to your system. The discharge after that is,
Yeah.
what are you giving us back? And that's where all the details come inside there.
Yeah.
You do your sampling for compliance, your metering if necessary, and all that stuff. And, if you look at regulatory entities, Oregon Health Authority says your potable intake point of delivery is always at the premise or property line of the facility. And that's similar to this, whereas but DEQ and EPA don't necessarily have similar language to that, so we have to say that, okay, as far as a discharger, we're going to put a metering station and sampling pit at the premise of the stations, and just model after the OHA model, which is point of delivery is the same thing, premise.
Okay, thank you. What kind of costs are associated with the discharge permit? Any thoughts on that? I see we have a fine of 5,000 or something throughout in the agreement someplace for violations, but.
That's variable.
Yeah, it would be.
To be
John?
determined, okay.
For a new user, they would have to pay for those connections. But since the connections are already made, I don't.
Existing ones gets a little bit of a trouble, do we pay for it or do they pay for it type of deal, but definitely a new customer would be worked into their connection, permit would be, we're gonna do these things in lieu of the discharge permit, and here's the cost to do so, and we do that currently. A new user comes in, we put a potable water meter and an RP in it, at their expense as part of the connection.
Mhm.
And it'd be no different now that when we're looking on the wastewater side of things, similar stuff. Existing though, that's something we've got to work out with them because it is an expense and it's not necessarily cheap.
Right, okay.
And
But it's not-
you're just talking about a connection fee?
Yeah, I was just curious what I think the connection fees or connections for existing are gonna be grandfathered in, it looks like, which I would agree with. The new ones, yeah, I was just asking roughly what a new one would be, and I appreciate the explanation of the equipment side of that. I hadn't thought about that. So, and then the discharge fee was just an off question, not that it makes a big difference. Is it a $10,000 fee to get a discharge fee? Is it a $1,000?
It varies a lot, John, because it depends on the infrastructure it takes to make that connection. That we use.
Okay.
Could be anywhere from 5,000 to $500,000. You never know.
Gotcha. So the discharge fee will be dependent on what they need to do to comply with the discharge permit. I mean, the quality of coming into, then I assume.
Quality and quantity.
Quality and quantity, yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
If I could clarify this ordinance, there a lot of times there'll be an application fee. This ordinance does not provide for an application fee. It also doesn't really address the charges to the facility for just the port to run its business. That's separate from this. There are provisions in here for requiring the facility to pay for monitoring or to pay for harm that they cause to the port system, but just the day-to-day fee for accepting their wastewater, that that isn't part of this ordinance and shouldn't be affected by this ordinance.
Yeah, we have a separate one with different rates that we've talked about in the past, so.
And we've never charged an application fee for anything that I'm aware of.
Okay, that's good. I think that's all the questions that I had, so thank you.
And that's about what I had too for myself. Any-
I have some questions, mostly on the wording. And we put an adjective in front of risk, so, like on D3, will not create any unreasonable risk. Are we opening ourselves up to a subjective term, and the next one down for will not pose a substantial risk? Or when we write those words in there, they're pretty arbitrary. What is a substantial risk to public health and safety?
Well, I guess I'll try to field that. The port would be the one deciding whether there's a substantial risk. If somebody were to be unhappy with what the port decided, they could always take the port to court. The idea with these weasel words, if you will, subjective terms, is it's hard to predict in an ordinance what the future will be and what future circumstance the port and the industry might face. So this is to give a little bit of flexibility to both the port and industry, where the port decides that something is not a substantial risk. The port can allow it. It is inherently subjective. I think if we took those words out, though, it would put the port in the position of having to regulate things that are trivial. And I think it makes industry nervous, to be honest. You're requiring us to absolutely comply with this provision when it's maybe not reasonable, or how can we run a business if we have to prepare for every risk, no matter how trivial? So it's designed to put a little bit of reasonableness into the system, so that if there really is a substantial risk, that this language is not going to prevent the port from acting on it. But it's to signal that this will be ordinance will be implemented in a rational way, and that at some level, we can trust the people running the port to act reasonably. That's kind of the concept behind including these words. But you're right, it does create, we can't mathematically say that, this is going to be the result in any given situation.
And for some, well, I don't know if they've changed. Each industry user, those terms might apply differently. I don't know if they would or not, but
Well, they
you
shouldn't.
know,
You're gonna,
but you could apply it to about anything, whether it's gallons per minute or pH levels, a 50 gallons a minute increase may not be unreasonable, but 5,000 is. Or, a pH increase of 10% may not be, but 3% is, or 20% is.
I mean, we're opening the door to our permit, basically, saying any unreasonable risk to our permit. I don't know that that's great language.
Can this be tied to the discharge permit? I mean, there's going to be specifics in the discharge permit, right? For each of the users, depending on their function and what they do. I would assume that if they get outside of the parameters set for the discharge, that it would become an unreasonable risk. Does that sound appropriate, or applicable or not?
The permit terms will be separately enforceable, and so that is the idea that the port will be able to tailor the requirements for each discharger depending on essentially the risk posed by that discharger.
Mm-hmm.
And so those, for example, you could set a discharge limit of no more than, I'm just making up a number, 500 parts per million total dissolved solids, period. So that's an enforceable limit, and they would have to meet that. There wouldn't be any, well, it was 550, so that didn't really impose a substantial risk. So it's not a violation. It would be a violation. So in the ordinance itself, though, the idea was to include a little bit of wiggle room so that again, the port could impose something that's reasonable. The permit conditions, though, those can be written absolutely as needed, and there's no wiggle room there. But that'll be decided on an individual basis.
So assuming we do that, then how would we know? We're going to put monitoring in, or monitoring is part of this agreement, correct? That's how we're going to know whether the water coming to us and the discharge either lives within their requirements or does not, correct?
That's right.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
How often will that be performed
Live,
live? So
Live.
everything,
not for all variables, because you can't make certain things you have to submit to a
Right.
live.
right?
So 24-hour basis at best case, but some constituents like say pH, which is a concern to our digesters, would be on a live basis.
Volume?
Mm-hmm.
Volume, yep. That's with the metering and stuff.
Well, for
How
me,
about-
it sounds like the waste or the discharge permit has the ability to regulate this, and an unreasonable would be exceeding those discharge permits because we're putting the plant at risk. So
Yeah, I think I have a little bit of trouble with the 10%. We say 10%. What if that 10% causes a substantial risk? Where are we at then? We've given them 10%. 10%,
So so the 10% is really the notice requirement. If it's 0.1%, but that causes a problem for the port, that this provision doesn't give the facility the ability to do that. It doesn't give them the ability to increase their discharge by 10%. It's the notice requirement. And the port, if the port is particularly concerned about a specific industry, for example, discharging something that's toxic, the port has the ability to include in the individual discharge a more stringent notification level. So if the port were particularly worried about some industry, it could write into the, any increase at all requires notice. But this is just sort of the default provision. If there's not something in the permit, you need to let us know if you're doing something that's going to increase the concentration or the amount by more than 10%. But that's just, again, a notice requirement. That doesn't mean that they're entitled to do that if that's going to cause a problem.
Okay.
Yeah, I can follow that. Yeah.
And there's nothing magic about that 10%. It's an arbitrary number that's intended to be small. We could pick another number that was just a guess as to what wouldn't drive the industry and MIF crazy with daily notices of change. But again, there's nothing magical about that particular number. We could adopt a different percentage.
How often do we test for other things besides the volume and the pH? How much, so the testing that we do or we require or is required by our permit, is that monthly, yearly?
Weekly.
weekly.
So every industry gets sampled on an annual basis, so once per year or more as we under discretion. All common pit areas get tested on a weekly basis. Now, going forward, how do we maintain compliance or making sure that, I mean, we're gonna have to test more often from the industry side of things, you know, is that once a week, is that once for 24 hours? I think that really depends on what we care about the most, that is gonna cause the biggest cause of concern. Off the top of my head, that would be, you know, health of the digester, pH is gonna be something more live, whereas TKN volumes are not necessarily so troublesome right up front, so I will fall back to what the permit tells me once per week to pull those off of there. And that could be coming from common pits and not necessarily industrial stuff, so it's a little different for each variable that comes off of there. Hazardous materials or hazardous chemical analysis, which we do on an annual basis for annual report, are going to stay the same, which, you know, this is what this describes here, is this requires if there's a change in your chemical makeup or they added a chemical, they'd have to notice us of that chemical, in which case we go back and analyze it. Is this in protection of groundwater? Does it meet the DEQ permit requirements? You need to check all the boxes off of that and do our due diligence off of that, and then put it in the massive SDS sheet now that we have in our O&M plan, which is, you've seen several binders now thick.
So if you had something that came back erroneous, do you retest? How much time before we say, you know, the 60 days, or do we make them fall into compliance immediately, or what's gonna be the?
Again, it depends on the variable. If it's something like pH that's out of whack, we're gonna be jumping on that right away, because that means the health of the digester is in a complete upset of the treatment system. So obviously, you know, it's an emergency level function. If it's other things that are above and beyond, like, let's say it's higher TSS ratings that we didn't necessarily want out there, and it's causing a solid or a particulate size problem within irrigation patterns or within our treatment systems, but it's not causing an upset. Okay, well, that's a more work with the industry. Well, what's going on? Is there an upset? Is there a post-treatment problem inside the plant that's just a temporary, you know, hang up, stuff like that? And work through it with them. It's like, okay, this is correctable and it's a one-time event. You know, where we have major reoccurrences constantly, what can we do to make that better? It kind of depends on the variable, whether it's an emergency to our treatment systems, or is it something that we just need to work with the industry to make a correction within the post-treatment, or is it just a lab error and it came back and we had to validate that, which can take time. Sometimes it's 7 to 14 days before you get that turned around, depending on variable that getting tested.
So then when does the, I'll have to go back and read it. When does the penalties for something like that happen? If you're going to say, well, it's a one-time occurrence, do they get the one-time penalty? When do we implement something like that? Is that up to the discretion of
I mean, that is totally up to the discretion of
Lisa?
and us and whatnot to determine whether or not it's damaging to our systems. I mean, you kill our digester, that's a really expensive, whoops. And they can come in there, and there is the potential of doing that with a high pH or low pH value. So now, I mean, that would be a decision point. Yeah, you're gonna be, you know, that's damaging equipment and issues with a treatment system versus something else is not necessarily damaging the system unless it caused an upset with, say, our permit. You cause a violation of our permit. Okay, now that's, you know, different. You have a flow chart of whether you do or you don't do things, I guess, is where I'm kind of going with that we work our way through.
This is all new territory for us, Kelly.
I know, I'm
I mean,
just, it's new for me too, so I'm
this is
just
just
trying
kind
to,
of the overarching document that will lead to those individual
Yeah.
agreements, and we'll have to talk about what is the trigger
Mhm.
for that violation and penalty.
And that's how I work through things. It's just basically go flow chart, yes or no. You go through this pattern and you can go down to until someone overrules me and says, this is, you know, what it looks like, because I have to look at everything logically. Did it or did it not cause a violation with this piece of paper? You know, did it cause an issue with my system over here and disrupt operations? And then I take it to Lisa or Mark and have a dose of reality get put inside of me for that.
Okay, my next question is, on the port will issue a connection pit permit for an indefinite term. That kind of makes me uncomfortable. I am on,
The D part of.
yeah, 3D.
Page 5, yeah.
D.
it's the discharge permit that's the key, I think, and that's where and it said the discharge permit for a term not to exceed 10 years. So the connection permit is, but not the discharge permit.
Yeah,
Mhm.
connection permit being indefinite is not necessarily a big deal because they're hooking a excise pipe to my system. But we didn't talk about what's going through that pipe. That's what the discharge permit's
Mm.
for.
Yeah, that's
You're just-
okay.
You're just giving me a pipe that's could potentially do something. The discharge permit details what that potential something is, and that's what matters more. And what has to be updated more often. Permit updates, discharge permits have to be updated, but a connection permit is always to remain the same. Unless a facility comes back and says, I no longer want a 4-inch pipe and I want a 12-inch pipe. Whole new connection permit at that point to have to go and deal with that.
So if it's changed,
But we still haven't talked about what went through that, which is what the discharge permit is. So indefinite connection.
okay, I'm good with that then.
Is 10 years too long? Just about right, Miff? What do you think?
That's with how the permits and stuff change off of that, which is kind of where Michael went with that time frame. So,
Okay.
I mean, I think there's some caveats in there that, if the permit were to be updated, then we could see a change in all those discharge permits at our discretion.
We have the language in this agreement to accommodate that.
Yes, so if there's the 10-year period, and this was a subject of internal discussion, so the expiration really forces the port. It's really more forcing the port to take the trouble to renew the permit. At any time, if there's a reason that the port needs to modify someone's permit because of something has changed in the port's permit, for example, or there's new information that, we thought this wasn't going to be a problem, but it really is a problem, the port can come in and modify those permits before they expire. So the expiration date is really more of a workload for the port. It just forces the port to rethink the needs for every discharger when their permit expires. So that's the thinking behind that, but nothing prevents the port from modifying the permit before it expires.
Should the
just
need arise.
Remember, this is the overarching document and it says not to exceed 10 years. We could have one that's 3 years, one that's 5 years. If something's more volatile, or we know they're going to double the size of their facilities, we'd probably make it for a shorter term so that we make sure that we're monitoring that.
Yeah. You're talking about the discharge permit, right, Lisa?
Discharge permit, yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay.
Any others, Kelly, that you?
Oh, I'm just reading through here.
All right.
Lots of things marked. And it does say, I guess maybe my question when I asked that, it just says periodic certification of compliance. But you're saying that it's going to be, there is more of a specific compliance than just periodic. This says periodic, so I just.
Which one are you on?
4.7.
So if I can take that, the idea there is that the port can require the industry to periodically certify certain things. The actual requirement that would be in the permit, the discharge permit that the port issues. So for example, it may require an annual certification that the discharger is not discharging anything toxic, or that it's not discharging hazardous waste. It's a way to make the facility responsible as appropriate for assuring the port that it's not doing something that it shouldn't be doing. A lot of things don't really lend themselves to monitoring requirements. For example, you're not discharging PFAS. monitoring for that is probably not going to be very helpful. It might be unreasonable, but you could require the industry to certify that they're not doing that. And if they falsely certify, then that's grounds for revoking their permit. It probably creates all sorts of other problems for them. But this provision is just giving the port the authority to require those periodic certifications. It may be for some facilities, no certification is appropriate, but that's really going to be the port's call.
Anything else for Michael? Niff?
So just to summarize what I'm getting out of this is basically a guideline for the port to make individual agreements with each business. Kind of a.
Correct.
Okay.
I would just
Well,
end
this
that by
goes-
saying it's not a guideline. It'll be an enforceable requirement.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it puts the teeth in it, doesn't it? So to speak.
Yes, and again, this is really coming from DEQ. The DEQ was concerned that the port did not have the sufficient ability to control what the wastewater coming into the port's facilities. So this is some pressure from DEQ, and this ordinance is similar to this sort of things that municipalities would have for their industrial dischargers. So it's not unique to the port. What's a little different from the standpoint of the port is that the port does not have a federal wastewater discharge permit, an NPDES permit. It's a state permit, so it's a lot of those federal rules don't apply to the port, but the overall concept is essentially the same.
When we have, go ahead, Joe.
No, you're fine.
I was just thinking, when our permit changes, do we notify all of our industrial users and do they understand and have a copy of what currently the regulations are and things? I mean, are they very well informed and we have a notification thing that says, hey, our permits changed and.
Almost every permit modification we've ever gone through in history, there always goes through a public comment period before the permit becomes, instated.
Mhm.
And we've always invited the industry to make comments on it, do you have analysis on it, do you have questions, do you have things that we want to get fed back to DEQ to have changes with inside there, so, and then afterwards, it's an actual permit at that point in time, and it's finalized, that always gets circulated around all the industry as well.
So if we have a change that occurs with our permit, how long do we have a period of time for them to fall into that compliance? Because we're going to be put into that compliance immediately. So are they going to have that? I mean,
I would say that period would have been within the public comment period when DEQ drops some of those permit modifications. I mean, usually we have good heads up off of that. DEQ has worked with us, and in some instances not.
so they set the timeline of when it has to be put into compliance
Yep,
of any
which
change.
is day one of the signature of the permit.
Okay. Mm.
Yep.
So what if it's a big change? Do we pay for those changes or that's industries?
Fair
Yes.
question.
Depends on what it is.
Okay, just,
No, good question.
Okay, any other questions, concerns anybody has that going over this? I was just gonna comment, get this enacted. It's not like it's gonna be a big rush of all this activity to get these connection permits the next day. And all that.
what's
Well,
DEQ
okay.
requiring?
Yeah, it'll take time
It'll
to
take
ease all these in.
And there's timelines within there. I believe there's wording in there to not necessarily exempt, but extend that timeline if necessary if we're working through that, because it's quite the burden to get through
Yeah.
some of these, and some of these are gonna take time.
Yeah.
Legacy plants included are gonna be the most challenging.
So DEQ is making this requirement there, and is there time, there's no timeline?
A ton of timeline, they've never given us a timeline yet, so.
Well,
This is-
we'll need,
Yeah, it is a big.
I'm sorry to interrupt there. The discharge permits will be important before we fire up the water treatment. I would think we're gonna need to know what's coming to us and have some enforcement ability there, so control.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Very much.
So the timeline that's laid out in the draft is that existing dischargers will have to apply for a discharge permit by February 1st. In this version, we've added a requirement that the port tell them 3 months in advance of that date what information needs to be included in their permit application. And then that facility can continue discharging until the port acts on their permit application. So they're continue to be grandfathered in until the port makes a decision on their application. At that point, I don't think there'll be any denials, but if the port were to deny the permit, then they would have to stop discharging. And then they would become subject to that permit when the port issues the permit. So hopefully that will be, it's really more myth, sometime next spring when those permits start getting issued.
As soon as we can get them done.
Yeah.
Should be a process.
Industry's okay with them. Well, you haven't written them yet, right? So you don't know. And it's gonna be individual. So you don't know. I mean, do they have the option of saying, we don't like this, but we just,
Sure they do.
Yeah.
okay.
And they will.
Okay, okay, just,
That's a good question, Commissioner. The port doesn't have a process for, what if they don't like a condition of the permit? There isn't a process for addressing that within the port. They, I guess, could ask Lisa to reconsider, but Lisa says no. Right now, their option would be to go to court to challenge that permit. One thing that some facilities asked for was an internal, administrative process for challenging permit decisions. That's something the commission may want to think about. It seemed premature at this point to develop something like that. I think the port's intent is to try to work with the industries so that we can reach a consensus on what's appropriate. But if there are a lot of challenges, the port may want to think about what some municipalities do, which is have essentially an administrative hearing process. But we decided not to include that at this point because it just seemed a little premature.
I guess I would have a concern that it's when the time shows up and we do need it, we don't have it, we'll be too late then. Is it difficult to include it? Are we looking to, we can't take action in this meeting. This will come to our next port commission meeting. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe we could see a draft of what that might look like, that administrative, whatever it was called. Should we choose to include it? I would hope, again, I will express optimism that we're going to work towards a mutually beneficial agreement with industry. I'd be shocked if that doesn't happen. So I don't foresee it, but like I made the comment earlier, this is the time to put these things in when they're not needed, in my opinion.
I was just gonna say that, John. I think that our goal is to make sure that this works for industry and it works for us, right? We just have to come to that common agreement that we've got some regulations and that we're making the best decisions for for our system and making sure that industry can live within those parameters and continue to do business. That's our goal here.
Again, back to administrative, whatever process that is, I'd much rather keep it local until we can't keep it local, honestly. So if we can work something out amongst the Port Commission and the industry users and not go to court, I'd prefer that. So I guess I'm interested in seeing maybe a paragraph that would address that.
Would that be applicable in this ordinance though? Michael, you know what John's asking? To,
Yeah, I guess a lot of different ways. I mean, first of all, it wouldn't stop from someone from going to court.
Sure.
Right.
It would just be a process they would be forced to go through before they could go to court. So that would be the purpose for it. There's all sorts of different ways. I mean, the city of Portland, for example, has a designated hearings officer. You go through a full, basically like a mini trial. That one of the concerns there is the port doesn't have the resources to do that. A somewhat simplified version would be, a requirement for a request for reconsideration. That might be helpful because it helps kind of focus what the issue is. We could direct that to Lisa, and then someone dissatisfied we could have an appeal to the commission, so that the commissioners could hear it and make the decision. So that's another possibility that wouldn't require an elaborate process, but would give everyone a chance to kind of pause and focus what their concern is, and then have a decision before they went to court. So if the commission would be interested in something like that, that's also something you could adopt as a separate ordinance if you didn't want to hold this up.
I kind of, if we're gonna do this, like the idea for the possibility to reconsider, a question to ask to be reconsidered. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with the commission itself negotiating these agreements. That would be over our heads probably.
But Commissioner, you wouldn't be negotiating it. You would simply be making the final decision.
Okay.
Maybe you wouldn't feel comfortable with that either, but a technical question, but that is one way to add a local process before someone went to court. So the commission, and it might not be a technical issue, it may be a question of policy that the commission might want to weigh in on.
I mean, you can put it in here and maybe that is a step of going back to the Port Commission.
yeah,
If you're not happy with the decisions as staff it is regulating, then you can appeal that to the Board of Commissioners or our commissioners.
I'd be all right with that. Yeah, that seems reasonable.
Yeah, I would too. Thank you.
Okay, would there be any other questions or concerns from commissioners or staff? Would it be appropriate to ask, our other members here if they've got?
Certainly.
I don't want to step too far out of bounds, because it is a workshop, but you're here interested, and I'd be interested in seeing what you might have.
We gave
They've given several comments.
two feedback sessions, if you will. And so, I mean, we recognize that this is just kind of the guidance, right, for enforcement. So I think we're okay with everything where it's at and forward to the discharge for the process.
But you've had some input and you feel good about, I don't know about good, but you've been contacted.
I mean,
You've had input.
yeah, we've been contacted. I think the communication on this has been really good.
Okay.
Here's where we're at. The changes based on everybody's input. And so we'll move forward. I mean, I'll be honest, it's a new process for me. But we've had our corporate team involved, a lot of feedback with our corporate folks as well as others, so, yeah. Good.
Good.
So quick comment, to follow along your comment, we've been engaged and provided the port comments and appreciate you taking the time to review those and respond and the feedback that we've gotten on those. I think I only have 2 comments or 1 question, 1 comment. One, does the port expect to have a formalized structure, like form or request for the discharge permit, or just a request for information that we need to send you when a permit comes out of that? Or will there be kind of a structured request that you ask us to fill out?
We're hoping to have a template for that. So there'll be a template that everybody gets. That should be fairly similar between each industry, and then of course there'll be changes between each industry for the variables that go into it. So
Sure.
that's the goal.
Great, and that's just so that we know we get you the information that you want in your request. And I think I just have 1 request for the port's consideration in item number 7, retention of records. In keeping with both how DEQ and well as Oregon Health Authority have moved to electronic record reporting and retention as part of their program. The requirement here for both retaining paper and electronic is
I get it.
significant.
I get it, but DEQ hasn't went to a digital format yet. So I have to submit everything in paper format.
Okay.
Yeah. It's great.
If I could clarify, that provision is intended so that if there is a paper copy that's related to compliance, you have to retain it. It's not intended to require a paper copy.
Okay,
Because I can print it.
okay. All right, yeah, that's the idea of housing
It's
printed copies.
something like I don't know, if you have an old school pH monitor with a strip chart, and that's your compliance, then you would need to keep that. But that provision is not intended by any means to require paper copies.
If there's a way to clarify that, that would be ideal, just for something for the board to consider. Thank you.
Okay. And is there a records retention policy that DEQ has? Because I know that there are set limits, like 7 years or whatever that might be, that we have to retain, and then after that, you can.
I'll defer to Michael on that, but there is a set time period in the general conditions of the permit thing.
Yeah, I believe it's only 3 years for the port. I might be incorrect. The 5 years was just intended because we see that a lot. So that seemed like a good thing to include in the ordinance. Again, the port we did add a provision that the port can waive that period if appropriate. So that would be something that could be, for example, could be included in the discharge permits. So if 3 years is sufficient to comply with DEQ, we can include in the permits a 3-year compliance period. And the way the ordinance is written, the port could do that. So we could include a shorter period.
I'd just like to have 1 more comment about the template for information. I would think that we'd use the same template, but we really, new customers coming on, we definitely need a template to find out what the constituents are in their water that they're giving us. So of course, we would use the same form for existing.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
I just offer, I appreciate the openness and transparency going through this process, and recognizing that the ultimate outcome is success for both parties. We hear that a lot, but it doesn't feel like that a lot, so we appreciate that. And like even to Miss comment about when a draft permit is issued by DEQ, giving industry a chance to review that in conjunction with the port and provide comments at that point in time, I think is very beneficial. So I think specifically to our written comments, we saw responses last night or yesterday afternoon. I was just going to ask, is like the comment period still open for another week to review what we received and provide any comments we might have back, or what's the time frame? What's it look like from now to completion or approval or
So
adoption.
we don't have two?
It's a
Yeah.
two
You have
readings.
to have two more readings.
Two more readings.
Yes. So
But they both gotta be the same. We asked about that. So any
Yes.
changes have to be
you start
before,
start the reading process all over.
which would be our meeting,
That's our
our
first
meeting
reading.
next
Like that
week.
first reading.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean you can't have more questions or clarifications that don't lead to any modifications.
Right.
I mean, keep
Sure.
talking.
Okay, that sounds about like that's about it. Anything else here that we could answer for you? Okay.
Nope. Just thank you for the chance to ask questions and discuss this.
Okay, yes. Very good. Okay, it looks like it's 10 after 10. We will adjourn our workshop.